Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and here again with a rather non-traditional Father's Day card. This is another card that can kind of be for many occasions and for anyone really. I just thought I would include it in my Father's Day card series. So I pulled out the Simon Says Stamp, Funny Food, and Breakfast Buddies stamp sets. I had made a promise that I would use a bunch more of the Doodlebug So Punny papers in these stamp sets because they go so well together, etc. and finally starting to get around to it. So I pulled out the individual little bread image and then this little loaf image, and I'm stamping them onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock with Ink on 3's Blackout ink. And I'm just using my stamp positioner to do this and stamping them multiple times so I get a good even stamped image. And then once that ink is dry, I just let it sit for a little bit, especially when I'm stamping multiple times. I either let it dry or I'll even speed that up with my heat tool, just because multiple layers of ink can take longer to dry. If you have trouble with your inks, when you're using Copic Markers and they're smearing, try that. Try letting it dry or using a heat tool, because more often than not, it's just because the actual stamped ink isn't completely dry yet. So I did very, very simple, very basic Copic coloring on these, almost no shading other than on the brown area of this loaf, and I listed the Copic colors I used in the description. I was kind of matching the color in the pattern paper I was going to use, which again was very simple. It was just kind of like a brown outline and then a very, very pale yellow for the bread, and then little pink cheeks, of course. So I kept, like I said, I kept the coloring simple and just filled it all in. And then while that loaf one was still a little wet with yellowing, I quickly dabbed on the pink just to give them those little cheeks. And then I used, of course, the same colors for the larger slice of bread here. And then once I get everything completely colored in, I'm going to use the coordinating die sets to die cut both of these out. I'm going to tape them into place with little bits of washi tape and then run them through my die cut machine. So once I have the images colored and die cut, I pulled out the pattern papers I wanted to use from the So Punny pack. And of course, there are papers that have the little bread images on them. So that was kind of my main one. And then I pulled out one of the plaid papers in the pack. And I'm using Simon's Basic Rectangles for the papers. And then I also just pulled out a scrap of heavier weight white cardstock. And I'm going to die cut that with one of the Simon nested circle dies. So I decided to tape all the dies into place. After finally pulling out my big Gemini, I just did a big old video on that. I can line all these up and die cut them all at once, which is kind of nice. So die cut all of these papers into the size I wanted. I had a rough idea of the kind of layout I wanted to do. So I've got the one pattern paper with all the little bread and, you know, bacon, etc. images is A2 size. I used the largest Simon die for that. So it's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And I flipped over the scrap of pattern paper left over from die cutting that. It's just this cute yellow pattern paper with little hearts on it. So I flipped that over and just trimmed it down with my paper trimmer so I can add that to my card front. So I'm going to tape all of the everything together with my foam or with my tape runner, and then for my sentiment I grabbed my ever handy piece of black cardstock that doesn't leave my desk until I use it up, and I use my anti-static powder tool on it, and I'm stamping one of the sentiments from the Funny Food set onto it with Ink on 3's Juicy Embossing ink, and then I'm going to use Simon's Detail White embossing powder on it. And then I'll let my heat tool heat up for a few seconds before bringing it to the paper and completely melting that embossing powder. And then once I've got that melted, I can use my paper trimmer to trim this down into an even little rectangle here. So like I said in a previous video, I'm like back on, you know, the love wagon with my Fiskars cutter. It just cuts so nicely. And I really like having that wire guide in the middle because I can see where I'm cutting. So I trim down my sentiment, and then I'm going to start adhering everything together here. So like I said, I'm going to use my little Xyron tape runner to adhere the pattern papers together just to keep everything kind of flat, fairly simple. So I've got my little plaid pattern paper that I'd purposely die cut a fair bit smaller because I didn't want to cover up all those cute little images on that main pattern paper. And then I'm going to add this little strip of yellow pattern paper. And then I pulled out, I still have a few bits of this baker's twine hanging around in my stash. So I added that to my card, and I'm just going to use that washi tape to tape down the end. Then I can wrap this around my card front, tape down the other end, and then I can just tie a simple little bow onto this really quick and easy. So I was going to use my reverse tweezers, and I've shown this in tons of videos over the years, to hold my bow in place. But instead I actually just, since I'm doing it this way, I don't need my reverse tweezers. I can just kind of basically do bunny ears, wrap them around, tie it. I'm not pulling it tight until I've got my bow kind of where I want it. I pinch the middle and I kind of readjust the bow until I'm happy with how everything looks, then pull it tight. So once I've got my bow in place and then trim off the ends, I'm going to pop my little white die cut circle on with some foam tape. And then I'm going to pop that little slice of bread there up with foam tape as well, just for some dimension. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the sentiment. Pop that on with foam tape as well and just kind of tuck it under the end of the bow there. So once I have that, it's funny, I wanted to stamp and emboss another sentiment, this one from the Breakfast Buddy set. And I just happened to have this little tiny square of scrap black cardstock that I just hadn't tossed yet, because little tiny pieces like this I rarely keep, because what are you going to do with them? It was the perfect size for this sentiment. I love when things like that happen sometimes. It was just perfect. So I stamped this little tiny I loaf you sentiment onto it with that juicy ink. Use the detail white embossing powder, and I'm holding this with my reverse tweezers because it's tiny and I need to heat emboss this, and you definitely burn your fingers trying to hold something this small when you're trying to heat emboss. So I'm holding it with my reverse tweezers, gonna melt that with my heat tool. And then to finish the inside of the card, this is heavyweight white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 11 and scored at 5 1/2. So it'll be a top folding A2 size card. And I die cut more of that plaid pattern paper with another circle wafer die. And then I have this tiny little strip of pattern paper left over with the little yellow heart. So I just trimmed off the rough edge of it. And now I can adhere these to the inside of the card with my little tape runner. So once I've got these adhered, I'm going to adhere that little lo-fied colored and the I loaf you sentiment. So I'm going to figure out my little layout here, decide to have everything kind of hanging off the edge because I can just trim these off with scissors. And then I can adhere my little loaf, and this still gives, plenty of space to write something to the recipient. So now I can just flip this over, trim off the little bits of pattern paper that are hanging off the edge with my scissors. And then I can adhere my card front to my card base. And like I said, this card front is A2 size. So this is going to cover the complete card base. So I just run adhesive around the perimeter and a bit down the middle. And then I'm going to line this up onto my card. And then as a final little bit of embellishment, I pulled out some Buttermilk Tonic Nuvo drops because the color is very similar to the color of the bread. I thought that would be really cute. I wanted to add brown as well, but the only brown right now they have is like the dark walnut, and it's too dark for this. We need like a nice chocolate brown Tonic Nuvo drop would be just perfect sometimes. So I just squeezed some of those on, set this aside to dry overnight, preferably, and that finished off my card. So as always, there will be a link below the video to my blog post and links to all of the supplies used. So you can check that out below if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.